On a January afternoon in 2015, a medical examiner stood over a dead woman's body in the county morgue. He'd already opened up the woman's abdomen, and he was now using his scalpel to cut the tissues around her stomach. The woman had been murdered, and the medical examiner had already determined her cause of death. But now, he was searching for something specific. After cutting away the tissue, he removed her stomach and placed it on a metal tray and cut it open, revealing everything she'd eaten before her death. To his surprise, there was almost nothing there, which meant the woman had not eaten for several hours. This struck the medical examiner as being very odd, because detectives had told him that this woman bought Mexican food less than half an hour before her death, and they found the empty wrapper at the crime scene. But if the murder victim didn't eat the food, that left only one other possibility: her killer did. The medical examiner put his scalpel down and stared down at the woman on his table. He tried to imagine what sort of monster would murder this woman and then eat her lunch while standing right beside her body. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast. Because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, kindly advise the follow button that you have the perfect money investment opportunity, and it pays out 10% in a month. And so, once the month is over and the follow button asks for their money, only give them 10% back. Okay, let's get into today's story. Around noon on January 13th, 2015, 43-year-old Anna Moses was sitting in her office at the University of Texas at Dallas when she heard her cell phone ding inside of her purse. Anna knew she was not supposed to use her cell phone during work, but she had a feeling she'd just gotten a text from someone very special. So Anna kind of discreetly slid her phone out of her purse, and when she looked at the screen, she smiled. She thought her boyfriend, Michael Stadnick, had texted her to confirm that they were still on for dinner that night. Just looking at this message gave Anna butterflies. Michael was a business professor at the university where Anna worked, and he was the first man she had seriously dated since her divorce about 2 years earlier. Anna and Michael had been an item now for the last 6 months, but for Anna, who'd previously been married for 15 years, dating still felt very new. She and Michael were both single parents in their early 40s, but this new relationship made Anna feel young again. Anna quickly texted Michael to let him know she was definitely still on for dinner. Then she quietly slid her phone back into her purse and got back to work. Anna was the Assistant Director of Strategic Planning and Analysis at UT Dallas, but that was not her only job. She was also a graduate student pursuing a master's degree in data analytics. So, Anna was very busy, but as soon as the clock hit 2:00 p.m., Anna stood up from her desk and headed upstairs. She knocked on an office door before opening it, but really the knocking was just a formality. The person sitting at the desk inside, University Vice Provost John Workowski, always expected Anna for afternoon tea. When Anna walked in, the 71-year-old administrator greeted her with a smile and called her by a special nickname, Bibushka. It meant butterfly in Russian, and hearing it made Anna feel nostalgic for the country where she grew up. Anna sat down across from Dr. Workowski, and right away he handed her a steaming cup of tea. Dr. Workowski had wild gray hair, big glasses, and he always smelled like cigarettes. Anna was not particularly fond of the smell in his office, but she still felt very comfortable with him, because over the past 2 years she'd spent hours in this office confiding to him about her personal life. Dr. Workowski knew things about Anna that most people simply didn't, like that she'd immigrated to the United States in 1998 just to marry her now ex-husband, Bob Moses. He and Anna had met in Russia when Bob was visiting as a tourist. Then they kept in touch through email for months until he finally asked her to marry him. Bob had been in a zinker in America, which made their divorce that much more painful for her. Anna and her ex, Bob, were still on very friendly terms, but at this point, Dr. Workowski had really taken over the role of being Anna's rock. Now that day, Anna and Dr. Workowski's conversations centered around Anna's 20-year-old son, Igor, who was a student right there at UT Dallas. Anna said she was worried that she and her son might be growing apart. The previous weekend, Igor had driven the 15 miles from his dorm to her home in Frisco, Texas, as he usually did, But Igor had seemed quiet and distant all weekend. It made Anna worry that he had some problem that he didn't want to talk about it. After all, Workowski sipped his tea, then told Anna she was a great mother and not to worry. Sometimes children, especially adult children, just need some space. He assured her that whatever was going on with him, Igor would eventually tell her when he was ready. And Poseidon said, you're probably right. Then she finished her tea, gave the doctor a hug, and headed back downstairs to her office. A couple hours later, at around 5:00 p.m., Anna turned off her computer and grabbed her purse. It was cold outside, in the 30 seconds, so near freezing. So Anna put on her own scarves before waving goodbye to her co-workers and walking outside to the parking garage. She got inside of her blue Hyundai sedan and then headed into rush hour traffic. Part of the way home, Anna's stomach began to growl. She was hungry. Anna looked at the clock and saw that it was 5:30, which meant her boyfriend Michael would not be picking her up for dinner for another 2 hours. So she decided to pull off the highway right then and go to a fast food restaurant, a Taco Bell that served Mexican food, and she went through the drive-thru and she bought a chicken quesadilla. Anna was really hungry, but after receiving the food, she didn't eat it in the car. Instead, she just set it on her passenger seat. Anna generally preferred to keep her surroundings really tidy, and so she never ate in her car. It was just a messy. About 15 minutes later, Anna turned into her neighborhood. As she approached her two-story brick house, she stopped beside her mailbox and rolled the window down to grab her mail. Then she pulled her Hyundai into the garage. Anna shut the garage door behind her. She gathered up her purse, her mail, and her quesadilla, and she got out of the car. She walked towards the door that led into her home, thinking about how excited she was for her date that night with Michael. But as she reached for the doorknob, Anna heard the sound of rustling behind her, followed by a loud clap. Just after 7:30 p.m. on the same day, Michael pulled up to Anna's house and he noticed all the lights were off, as if Anna was not home. Michael was confused, but he got out of his car and knocked on Anna's front door. When she didn't answer, he called her, but she didn't pick up. Michael thought about going inside and had actually recently given him a house key, but he knew Anna always turned on her alarm system when she left the house. And he didn't know the code to disable it, and he didn't want to set it off and cause a scene in such a quiet neighborhood. Michael began to feel cold just standing outside, so he turned around, went back to his car, and tried calling Anna again. But Anna's phone again went to voicemail. Anna had never missed a date with Michael before, but Michael told himself, Anna was very busy. She was a grad student and a mother. She could have easily gotten sidetracked with any number of things. So, even though he was very disappointed, Michael decided to go home and wait for Anna to call him back. He was sure she would explain everything as soon as she could. The next morning at 9:00 a.m., Michael once again pulled into Anna's driveway. He had continued calling and texting her until 11:00 p.m. the previous night, but she never responded. Michael even contacted Anna's friends to ask about her, but they too had not heard from her. And so when Michael woke up on this morning with no text or no calls from Anna, the first thing he did was drive to her house. Michael knocked on the front door, and when there was no response, instead of going in, he instead called the Frisco Police Department. He told the dispatcher that he hadn't heard from his girlfriend since the previous afternoon when she was working at UT Dallas. And now, he was at her house knocking on her door and she wasn't answering. And she wasn't answering phone calls or text messages. And so, he asked if somebody could come out to her house to make sure she was okay. The dispatcher was obviously empathetic, but they told Michael that for this type of thing, protocol was he would need to call the university's campus police first, and then if for some reason they couldn't handle it, then they would ratchet this up to the Frisco Police Department. And so Michael hung up and then looked up the number for the university campus police and called them. And they promised him they would look into the situation right away. Michael thanked them and hung up, and even though he still felt very uneasy about this, he had to get to work. So he got into his car and drove away. Less than an hour later, Frisco Police Sergeant Jay Ream received a call from the University of Texas Dallas Campus Police. They told Sergeant Ream they were looking for a university employee named Anna Moses. Her boyfriend had just called to request a welfare check, and the campus police had quickly learned that Anna did not show up for work that day, which her co-workers said was highly unusual. Because Anna was not actually living on campus, the university officer asked Reem if he could go check her home in Frisco. Reem said he was on it, and a few minutes later, he was out the door headed towards Anna's address. Reem got there at 10. 0 a.m. and knocked on the door. When nobody answered, Sergeant Reem tried the doorknob, but it was locked. Reem knew he could knock down this door, but that seemed extreme. Instead, he called the campus police back and asked if they knew anyone who could let him inside. Over an hour later at 5 p.m., two cars pulled up outside of Anna's house. A campus police officer stepped out of one, and Anna's son, Igor, got out of the other. The university police had been able to find Igor on campus, and he told them he had a key and knew the alarm code to his mother's house. Igor nodded curtly at Sergeant Reem, then unlocked his mother's front door and walked inside and disabled the alarm. As Reem entered Anna's home, Igor walked past him and back outside. He did not seem concerned at all about his mother. He just said he'd be out in the car waiting for her whenever they were done. Sergeant Reem thought Igor's behavior was strange, but he couldn't worry about that right now. Instead, he and the university police officer walked into Anna's foyer. The house was totally silent except for the officer's footsteps on the tile. They searched the first floor, but they didn't find any sign of Anna, and they were about to head upstairs when the sergeant remembered they should scope out the garage. Reem made his way to the door that led to the garage and he opened it. And right away, even in the darkness, he could tell Anna's car was not parked inside, making the garage feel very empty. Then he flipped on the overhead light and he gasped. Anna was lying on her back on the garage floor with blood coming out of her mouth, and there were bullet casings all around her. It was obvious just from looking at her that she was deceased. The university officer came over and looked into the garage too, and instantly brought a hand up to his mouth in shock. Neither of the officers had ever seen anything like this before. Frisco was an extremely safe community with very few violent crimes. It actually had been called one of the safest cities in the entire United States. But that only made Anna's apparent murder that much more shocking. Her quiet suburban home was now a crime scene. Even though he rarely worked homicide cases, Sergeant Reem knew the protocol. First, he and the university officer backed out of the garage and closed the door, so they would not disturb any evidence. Then they checked the rest of Anna's home to make sure nobody else was there. Once they confirmed the house was empty, Reem called the Frisco Police Department for assistance. Reem then slowly walked outside towards Igor's car parked by the curb. As he got closer, Igor rolled down the window and looked at the sergeant without saying anything. Once he reached the car, Reem took a deep breath and told Igor that he had terrible news. His mother was dead, and it looked like she'd been murdered. The sergeant watched Igor for a reaction, but the young man's face was blank. Then Igor just furrowed his eyebrows and asked if his mother was in one piece. Sergeant Reem was so surprised by this question that he just said, "Well, yeah?" Igor nodded and then said he had to go because he had class. Reem had no idea what to make of Igor's very bizarre reaction. It was so odd, but Igor had just received this life-shattering news and Reem knew. You know, shock can make people behave in totally inexplicable ways. So for now, Reem decided to give Igor a pass, and he just figured, they would do everything they could to find out what happened to his mother. Then the sergeant heard a siren blaring, and he looked up to see a Frisco PD cruiser heading his way. A few minutes later, Frisco Detective Brian Schut and Texas Ranger Ruben Mank stood inside of Anna's garage. The two men were from different agencies, but they'd both been assigned to lead the case together. The crime scene made Schut feel totally sick. He was a very young detective, and this wasn't just the first time he'd be leading a murder investigation. This was his first murder case that he'd ever worked on. Detective Schut squatted next to Anna's body. She was still wearing a heavy coat and scarves, but he could see a bullet wound in her neck. And scattered on the floor around her were a few unopened envelopes, an empty Taco Bell wrapper, and a black purse. There were also a handful of bullet casings, which the detective identified as coming from a .22 caliber gun. Detective S.C.H. Udy told Mencken that it seemed like Anna had been outside, which is why she was wearing warm clothes. And she had come in and was carrying her mail purse and fast food trash when somebody shot her in her garage. S.C.H. Udy figured that Anna had likely been killed the previous evening when she came home from work. Ranger Mencken nodded in agreement, but he pointed out that Anna's car wasn't parked in the driveway or the garage, so he wondered if her killer had stolen it. Maybe Anna had been killed during a robbery. But then Detective S.C.H. Udy opened up Anna's black purse, and it didn't seem like anybody had rifled through it. And Anna's wallet, which contained $300 in cash, was still inside her purse. And the inside of Anna's household looked totally undisturbed. So, if this was a robbery, the only thing the killer stole was Anna's car, which didn't really make any sense. S.C.H. Udy told Mencken that he really wasn't sure about the robbery theory. It felt kind of weak, but the missing car did give them a good place to start. So S.C.H. Udy radioed the Frisco Police Department and asked a fellow officer to put out a bulletin about Anna's stolen vehicle. But at the same time, S.C.H. Udy was thinking to himself that it seemed most likely that Anna had been killed by somebody she knew. After all, the killer had clearly gained access to the garage without breaking in on it. The young detective couldn't stop thinking about the very strange statements and behavior of Anna's son, which the local police had briefed him about. S.C.H. Udy really wanted to interview Igor as soon as possible. Later that afternoon, Detective S.C.H. Udy sat down across from Igor inside of an interview room at the Frisco police station. Igor looked remarkably calm when he spoke. His voice was flat and emotionless. The detective asked Igor to please talk about his relationship with his mother. Igor said that he and his mother had always been very close. They both loved music, and when Igor joined a Christian rock band as a teenager, his mom supported him and came to almost all of his shows. Even now that Igor was living on his own at college, he still went home to visit her every weekend. Anna kind of babied him by doing his laundry and cooking for him, but Igor kind of liked it. But he said seeing Anna divorce his dad had been really difficult. Bob actually was not Igor's biological father. He had adopted him. And so for Igor, he looked at Bob as his father. That was his dad. And when Igor said that, S.C.H. Udy stopped him because he hadn't realized Bob was not his biological father. But Igor explained that his mother had actually been married twice, once briefly to a man in Russia, and then to Bob in the United States. The Russian man was Igor's biological father, but Bob had legally adopted Igor when he was just 4 years old. And as Igor talked about his dad Bob, he became emotional. Igor said he personally had been diagnosed with a rare form of bone cancer when he was just 8 years old, and his dad had always been there to support him. Igor's cancer eventually went into remission, but the experience showed Igor that Bob genuinely loved him like he was his own son. Detective S.C.H. Udy couldn't help but feel moved by Igor's story, but he wanted to stay focused on the horrible crime he was still investigating. So he asked Igor if there was anyone who would want to hurt his mother. Igor thought for a moment and then said no, but he added whoever killed his mother should be forgiven. Igor said he was a devout Christian and he believed all people, even killers, should be treated with mercy. S.C.H. Udy was shocked. Igor did not seem to care at all that his mother was horribly murdered. But the detective just stared at the college student, trying to remain professional, and followed up by asking Igor where he'd been the previous evening. Igor said he had been in class from around 5:30 p.m. to 9:45 p.m., and he had classmates who could vouch for him. S.C.H. Udy did not have any evidence that would allow him to hold Igor any longer, though he still felt very suspicious of him. But despite S.C.H. Udy's inexperience as a detective, he still knew the worst thing an investigator could do right now was get tunnel vision about one suspect. For now, he knew he needed to explore every possibility, and he knew exactly who he wanted to talk to next, Anna's ex-husband and Igor's dad, Bob. After S.C.H. Udy told Igor he was free to go, the detective went to his office and he saw Ranger Mencken had left him a note about the progress in his investigation, and that the medical examiner had sent a copy of an autopsy report over. Mankin's note explained that he had been able to reconstruct Anna's last day by obtaining security camera footage from UT Dallas, local toll roads, a Taco Bell, and also an elementary school near Anna's house. After reviewing this footage, Mankin estimated that Anna got home from work between 5:50 and 5:55 p.m. on January 13th. And based on the crime scene, he felt certain she was killed almost immediately when she went inside. Next, SCHUD looked over the autopsy report that was sent over, which largely supported Mankin's theory about when Anna was killed. The medical examiner said Anna had been shot at close range 6 times. All of the bullets came from the same .22 caliber gun, and the wounds were grouped tightly together, which made the medical examiner think her killer had some level of experience using firearms. But there was one odd detail that really stood out to the medical examiner. The detectives had told him before he did the autopsy that Anna had bought a quesadilla at around 5:30 p.m., which would be less than half an hour before she was killed. And considering they found the empty wrapper for this quesadilla next to her dead body, it suggested she had eaten it. However, when the medical examiner examined Anna's stomach contents, it looked like she hadn't eaten for many hours prior to her death. And if Anna didn't eat that quesadilla, well, according to the medical examiner, it seemed highly possible that her killer did. SCHUD was so disturbed by the idea of somebody who could shoot someone in cold blood 6 times, kill them right in their house, and then pick up their Taco Bell and eat it over their body. It just seems so unbelievably psychotic. And so SCHUD called Ranger Mankin and said he knew it was late, but they did not have time to waste. They really needed to dig him right now. So shortly before midnight on Wednesday, January 14, SCHUD and Mankin knocked on the door of a medium-sized home in Frisco. This is where Bob had been living since his Aunt Dana's divorce. He was renting a room and sharing the home with 3 other men. Bob answered the door. He was wearing pajamas and looked confused to see the police. He asked if everything was okay, and Detective SCHUD just said no. They needed to speak with him about his ex-wife, but it would be better if they talked at the police station. But Bob didn't move right away. Instead, he stayed in his doorway and just kept asking, like, really, what's happening here? Can you tell me anything else? And finally, Detective SCHUD said, I'm sorry, but unfortunately your ex-wife is dead. As soon as he said it, Bob's face just fell, and he agreed to go with them to the station. Bob's interview began at 1:00 a.m., so it was now Thursday, January 15th. And it wasn't until SCHUD Mankin and Bob were actually sitting in the interview room that they told Bob Anna was not just dead, she had been murdered. Bob looked horrified, and his first question was, is Igor okay? The police assured Bob that Igor was fine. Then Ranger Mankin asked Bob where he'd been on the evening of January 13th, the night that Anna was killed. Bob said he'd been home watching TV until about 7. And then he went out for dinner. And he said his 3 housemates could easily confirm his story. Bob admitted he owned 5 guns, 3 of which were .22 caliber, and he agreed to hand them all over to police for ballistics analysis. And when detectives asked him for a DNA sample, he gave them a swab without any hesitation. Ranger Mankin thanked Bob for his cooperation and told him he was free to go. After Bob was gone, both Mankin and SCHUD agreed that Bob did seem honest and seemed genuinely distressed at his ex-wife's death, but they still needed to follow up on his alibi. However, it was super late, nearly 2:00 a.m., and so SCHUD and Mankin decided to call it a day. But just then, SCHUD's phone rang. A Frisco Police Department patrol officer told him that they had just found Anna's stolen car in a residential neighborhood a few blocks away from her house, and the patrol officer was pretty sure they could see blood inside. SCHUD's heart started to race. He told the patrol officer to make sure nobody touched that car. In the meantime, he would arrange for a tow truck to bring the vehicle to the crime lab for analysis. After a few hours of sleep, SCHUD arrived at the Frisco Police Department crime lab early on Thursday morning. Anna's blue Hyundai sedan was there, and a technician was waiting to brief the detective on what they'd found. The technician said the vehicle was remarkably clean inside, except for a few things. There was an empty Red Bull energy can. There was a cigarette butt, and there were 2 small blood stains, one on the right side of the driver's seat and one on the center console. SCHUD was really excited at this news, and so he had the can, cigarette, and swabs of the blood sent off for DNA testing, along with the swab that Bob had given them during his interview. But SCHUD knew it could take weeks to get these results back, so for now he still had to continue with old-fashioned detective work. The most obvious person to interview next was Anna's boyfriend, Michael. He agreed to come in for an interview, and soon SCHUD was sitting across from the business professor at the police station. Michael leaned forward and ran his hands through his short brown hair. He looked anxious, and before SCHUD even began the interview, Michael asked if he should have a lawyer. The detective promised him this was all totally routine. Michael picked at his fingernails as he told SCHUD that he and Anna had not been dating for very long, but their relationship had been moving in a good direction. He said a few days ago, on January 13th, he'd gone to Anna's house to pick her up just after 7:30, and he'd been confused by her absence. And now he was horrified to know Anna had been lying dead in her garage the entire time he was there. Once Michael began talking, he started to open up a bit more, but as soon as SCHUD asked him for a DNA sample, he clammed up. Then he asked again about maybe getting a lawyer. The detective said that really wasn't necessary, but he would give Michael some time alone to decide whether he wanted to cooperate. SCHUD left, but what Michael didn't know was that the detective could still see and hear Michael through a camera in the corner of the room. So SCHUD watched as Michael began mumbling to himself. The detective could not make out all the words, but at one point Michael asked himself, "Am I overreacting?" A few minutes later, the detectives went back and asked Michael if he had made a decision. Michael said yes. He said he would give a sample of his DNA. SCHUD smiled, and then he got the swab from Michael and told him he was free to go. Then SCHUD sent this newest DNA sample to be tested against the other items from Anna's car. While they waited for the DNA results, Detective SCHUD and Ranger Mankin interviewed some of Anna's friends and co-workers. And quickly the investigators soon learned that Bob and Michael were not the only men in Anna's life. Anna's friends pointed detectives towards a man named Jerry Cuspel, a poet who they said had a deep spiritual bond with Anna. Her co-workers also mentioned a vice provost at UT Dallas named Dr. John Workowski, who seemed to be Anna's mentor. Detective SCHUD contacted Jerry first, and when he arrived for his interview, he was totally overwrought and on the brink of tears. He told the detective that Anna was his muse, and without her, he didn't know if he'd ever be able to write poetry again. SCHUD narrowed his eyes at Jerry's very melodramatic display, but he let him keep talking. Jerry explained that he met Anna at a public speaking course a few years back, and they bonded over their love of art. They often went to the opera together, and Anna would read and edit Jerry's poems. He published books of poetry and dedicated them both to her. SCHUD thought this connection sounded very intense, so he asked Jerry what his boyfriend thought about them being so close. And Jerry looked surprised. He said he didn't even know Anna had a boyfriend, but regardless, he insisted their relationship was not romantic. It was purely spiritual. The detective found the whole tale pretty hard to believe. He asked Jerry if he owned any firearms, and Jerry said yes, he had a .22 caliber handgun, but he quickly agreed to let the police analyze it, and he also gave them a DNA sample. Next, SCHUD asked where Jerry was around 6:00 p.m. on January 13th. Jerry said he was driving home from work on a Dallas toll road that was very far away from Anna's home, and the toll records would certainly reflected that. SCHUD thanked Jerry, and as soon as the poet left, SCHUD just shook his head. It did not seem like Jerry was a viable suspect. So he called the next man on his list. A few days later, Detective SCHUD began to interview Dr. John Workowski. The university administrator explained that he met Anna through work, and they grew very close during her divorce. Then Dr. Workowski said something surprising. He told the detective that he and Anna once had an affair. SCHUD stared at the man who was 70 years old, making him 27 years older than Anna. Dr. Workowski said he knew that he and Anna seemed like an unlikely pair, but it really was true. He said Anna wanted to have a relationship with him and he had had to cut it off because of their age difference. It just seemed totally inappropriate, but they still remained close friends. And so Dr. Workowski knew very intimate details about her life, like how she struggled emotionally and financially after her divorce. Dr. Workowski said he considered it his privilege to help Anna with money. In fact, in the 2 years since her divorce, he'd wired her a total of $46,000. Dr. Workowski insisted this money was given as a gift with no strings attached, but SCHUD was not convinced. He wondered if maybe, during one of their intimate conversations, Anna had learned something about the administrator that he wanted to keep hidden. What if those gifts were actually hush money payments? Or maybe he was paying Anna for sex and she was threatening to expose him. Thinking about the items found in Anna's car, SCHUD asked Dr. Workowski if he drank energy drinks or smoked cigarettes. Dr. Workowski said he didn't like energy drinks, but he definitely smoked. And when the detective asked for his whereabouts on the evening of January 13, the administrator said the same thing Jerry did. He was driving home from work on a toll road that was far away from his home, and certainly the records would reflect that. SCHUD made a note of this, but unlike Jerry, he didn't think this let Dr. Workowski off the hook. So SCHUD asked the administrator if he'd be willing to give a voluntary DNA sample. Dr. Workowski said he was happy to do anything that would help the police solve this case. So he let the detective swab the inside of his cheek before he left the police station. At this point, Detective SCHUD felt like he had 5 strong suspects: Anna's son Igor, her ex-husband Bob, and her boyfriend Michael, plus the poet Jerry and the university administrator, Dr. John Workowski. They all claimed to have alibis. However, none of them had been corroborated yet. Detective SCHUD briefed Mencken in on everything he discovered about these suspects, and Mencken agreed that they couldn't rule any of them out quite yet. Shortly after that, the detectives got disappointing news from the ballistics analysis on Bob and Jerry's guns. None of the guns matched the one that killed Anna, so they still didn't have the murder weapon. SCHUD sighed. Until he got the DNA results and Mencken finished investigating their suspects' alibis, he had no other leads to pursue. But Detective SCHUD didn't want to just sit around waiting for other investigators to do their work. So he started wondering if maybe he should go back to Anna's house and have another look around. Police had done an initial search, but there was always a chance something got missed. So SCHUD obtained a search warrant in late January. About 2 weeks after Anna's murder, he returned to her home. When he got there, he saw there were 2 cars parked outside. So he went up to the door and knocked and was surprised when his ex-husband, Bob, answered the door. Igor was standing just a few feet behind him. It turned out the father and son had moved into Anna's home a couple weeks ago, one day after her body was found in the garage. This struck the detective as a very strange thing to do, but Bob quickly explained that he and his son were grieving together. And because Igor lived in a college dorm and Bob lived in a house with 3 other men, Anna's home was the only private place they could go to place. SCHUD said that did make sense. However, even though they wanted private time, he held up a search warrant and said he needed to come inside. So Bob immediately opened the door wide and said, "Come on in." The first thing SCHUD did is he went into Anna's home office. There he dug through her desk drawers until he found something that stopped him in his tracks. It was a copy of Anna's life insurance policy. Anna had taken out a policy worth $750,000, and she had named one person as the sole beneficiary, her son, Igor's son. Suddenly it looked like Igor, whose behavior had struck investigators as very odd from the onset, stood to gain a lot from his mother's death. Then SCHUD managed to jimmy open a locked drawer in her desk, and he found something even more interesting. It was a handwritten letter, mostly in Russian. He couldn't understand what it said because he didn't speak Russian, but he figured it must contain something very private since Anna had kept it in a locked drawer. SCHUD quietly slid the letter into an envelope and then left the desk and finished searching the rest of the house. He didn't find anything else in the house of note, and so after he left and got back to the police station, he sent a copy of that letter to the FBI so an agent who spoke Russian could translate it for him. In early February, Detective S.C.H. Udy received a translation of that letter from Anna's desk, and suddenly, Anna's murder started to make a lot more sense. Anna had written this letter herself about one of the police's suspects, and it cast her connection to this man into a totally new light. Next, Ranger Mankin reported back that he had checked out all 5 men's alibis, and he'd been able to verify all of their stories except for one of them. The person whose alibi could not be confirmed was also the same person Anna had written about in her letter. And finally, S.C.H. Udy got the results of the DNA analysis. DNA from the Red Bull Cannon cigarette but in Anna's car did not match any of the suspects, and it didn't match anybody in their criminal database. But those blood stains found in Anna's car did match a suspect, the same one who did not have an alibi and who Anna wrote about. And so, based on this evidence, along with further investigation into this primary suspect, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Anna Moses when she returned home from work on January 13, 2015. Late that afternoon, Anna's killer crouched in a corner of her garage, clutching a .22 caliber rifle. He'd been able to slip inside a few minutes earlier because he knew the code to open the garage door. Now he was waiting for Anna to get home. Just past 5:50 p.m., the killer heard the sound of the automatic garage door sliding open. Light began to fill the dark garage, and so, as it did, he pressed his body back against the wall, trying to be as small and out of sight as possible. He watched as Anna pulled her car inside. The garage door shut, and the killer heard Anna's car door open and then close. Then, he listened to her footsteps as she walked towards the door to her house. But before she could open it, the killer stood, raised his gun, and fired 3 shots into her back. Anna spun around in shock. She dropped her mail purse and the quesadilla she'd been carrying but not eating. Before she could say anything, the killer fired 3 more shots to hit Anna in the chest and the other hit her in the neck. Anna crumpled to the ground with blood flowing out of her mouth. Anna's killer slowly lowered his rifle and walked towards her. He watched her chest for any sign of movement, but it wasn't moving. She was not breathing. So he picked up her car keys off the floor and was about to get into her car when he saw the unit chicken quesadilla on the floor. So he picked it up, ate it right next to her body, and left the wrapper behind. The killer then got into Anna's car, opened up the garage door again, backed out, and shut the door as he drove away. But he didn't realize that he had a cut on his right hand, and it was leaking blood onto Anna's car's seat and center console. The following evening, the killer abandoned the blue Hyundai in a neighborhood a few blocks away from Anna's home. And as law enforcement investigated Anna's murder, her killer did his best to appear very cooperative. He agreed to be interviewed and he agreed to give a swab of his DNA. But at the same time, the killer was kind of putting on this act in the background. He was doing everything he could to profit off of Anna's death. And that's what police understood as soon as they read the translation of that Russian letter. It was a note that Anna had written to her lawyer in 2013 during her divorce from Bob, and she told her lawyer that Bob was now threatening to kill himself and frame Anna as his murderer, just so her son Igor would hate her. When Detective S.C.H. Udy read this, he realized Anna and Bob's divorce was not nearly as amicable as people thought. In fact, the couple had a long history of problems. In 2008, Anna visited a counselor after learning Bob had an affair. She wanted to leave him but said she felt indebted to him because of how much he'd helped her during Igor's cancer battle. And years later, Anna had called one of her close friends crying, saying she had locked herself in a closet because she was afraid Bob was going to kill her. Anna hid these ugly realities about Bob from her son because she knew her son loved Bob. Bob was the only father figure Igor had ever known, and Anna didn't want to damage that relationship, even if it meant she had to act friendly towards a man she feared. But Bob was angry that Anna divorced him, and he was filled with jealousy over Anna's relationship with Michael. Adding to Bob's bitterness, Anna got total ownership of the large two-story house they used to share. Bob claimed that at the time Anna was killed, he was at home watching TV, but his housemates told police they did not remember him being home at that time. And while none of Bob's guns matched the murder weapon, He was a military veteran with experience using guns, and so police believe Bob must have taken apart the murder weapon and hid or destroyed the pieces. And if police had any doubts that Bob was the killer, well, the DNA evidence totally erased those doubts. It was clearly Bob's blood inside of Anna's car, likely from a cut on Bob's right hand that he had bandaged by the time he met with police. On February 26, 2015, Detective S.C.H. Udian Ranger Mankin arrested Bob at Anna's home. Bob maintained his innocence and pleaded not guilty. At his trial, Bob's defense argued that there were too many unanswered questions in Anna's murder, like whose DNA was on the Red Bull can in the cigarette but found in Anna's car. But the prosecution argued that Bob may have planted this evidence just to confuse investigators. In the end, a jury found Bob guilty of murder and a judge sentenced him to life in prison. Bob would appeal his conviction in 2018, but an appeals court upheld the jury's original ruling. And to this day, Bob remains incarcerated. On January 17, 2001, a woman was exercising at her local gym in Amityville, New York, when suddenly she looked up and noticed something towards the back of the gym. At first, she couldn't tell what it was, and so she wiped the sweat from her face and then she looked again. And when she realized what she was looking at, she pointed and screamed. And what she saw would send fear all through the town of Amityville, a town that was already famously linked to mass murder and to possible demon possession. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast. Because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the Amazon Music follow button asks you if they can have a bite of your sandwich, tell them yes, of course, and then right as you're about to hand it over, immediately retract your hand and shove the entire sandwich into your mouth and turn around and walk away. Okay, let's get into today's story. In early 2001, 32-year-old Alex Alge stood behind the front desk at the Dolphin Fitness Club in Amityville, New York. Alex loved the sounds of a crowded gym, the music pumping through the speakers, weights sliding onto bars, and people cheering each other on as they hit their fitness goals. And a crowded gym also meant that Alex was making money. He and his best friend, Paul Rydell, had opened up Dolphin Fitness 2 years earlier, and they had turned it into a favorite spot for serious weightlifters and amateur weightlifters alike. There was no question Alex was happy about all the money he was bringing in. He'd always dreamed of being a very successful entrepreneur. But the gym was a lot more to him than just a business. Amityville was a small town on Long Island with a strong sense of community, and Alex wanted his and Paul's gym to reflect that. So, from the day they had opened Dolphin Fitness, Alex said he wanted everybody who stepped through the doors to feel like they were part of a family. It didn't matter if people were old or young or what kind of shape they were in. Alex went out of his way to help his customers feel good about themselves and to feel like they belong. And his customers loved him for it. Alex stepped out from behind the front desk and began making his rounds on the gym floor. Alex was a really strong guy. He was just about 6 feet, maybe a little bit under, but he looked like a very serious bodybuilder, super jacked. So, most people at the gym called him Big Al. Alex had dark hair and a dark goatee, and on this day he was wearing a long-sleeve black shirt and tight jeans, his standard outfit at work. Alex said hello to just about everybody on the gym floor. He knew pretty much everybody by name, and he was excited to see some new members starting off the new year by coming to his gym. Just then, a young man waved at Alex and asked if he wouldn't mind coming over and spotting him on the bench, and Alex said that was fine. And he walked over to the bench press, and Alex told the young man he'd be ready to grab the bar if the young man struggled to lift it. So the young man took a deep breath. He grabbed the bar, brought it down to his chest, and then in one slow but steady movement, he pressed the bar all the way up. And Alex spotted him the whole time, shouting words of encouragement. And then, finally, when the young man had fully extended his arms and fully did a rep, he racked the bar, and he and Alex exchanged high fives and cheered like he just won the Super Bowl or something. Just then, Alex turned and saw a couple of people standing by the front desk. He figured they were potential new members, so Alex scanned the gym and then just shook his head. His partner, Paul, was supposed to be here right now working too, and really, it would have been his job to talk to these two new potential members. But Alex hadn't seen Paul on the gym floor in hours. So Alex walked away from the young man he had just spotted and headed over to the front desk and smiled wide and greeted the couple. The rest of that night pretty much went the same way. Alex did everything and ran the gym, and Paul didn't show his face again. And by the end of the night, after Alex had said goodbye to the last customers and walked up, he was feeling frustrated. Why should he do all the work, but still give Paul half the profits? Alex angrily marched his way towards the back of the gym, past some aerobics rooms to a small office. Alex knew this is where he would find Paul. Alex opened the door and there was Paul, hunched over in a chair and tapping his fingers on a table. Paul didn't look up when Alex walked in. It was like he was off in his own world. Alex figured Paul must be high on cocaine or some other drug. It was a sight that Alex saw way too often. It made him mad because Paul was his business partner and he wasn't doing his job. But it also broke Alex's heart because Paul really was his best friend. And to see him struggle like this was hard. The two men had known each other for years, and they'd gotten along from the first time they'd met. They'd both grown up as working class kids who dreamed of having their own business someday. And they both loved lifting weights and body butters. So, after becoming fast friends, they began to come up with a plan to open their own gym. For years, Alex and Paul had worked different jobs to save up money, and they had also found some outside investors who believed in them. And so eventually, when they had scraped all the cash together, they opened up Dolphin Fitness together. Now, most people who knew them said these two were closer than brothers. Alex had been Paul's best man at his wedding, and he was the godfather to Paul and his wife, Lean's baby boy. Back in the office, Alex shouted Paul's name, and Paul finally realized Alex was in the room with him. When Paul turned around and looked up, Alex could see his eyes were totally bloodshot. Alex really laid into Paul for not helping him run the gym that night, and he said he didn't understand what Paul was even doing with his life. They had achieved their dream of starting their own business, and on top of that, Paul had a beautiful wife and child. So why was he throwing everything away on drugs and partying like he was still a crazy bachelor in his early 20s? Paul was very defensive and shouted a few obscenities at Alex, and then basically just told Alex to leave him alone. But Alex said he'd had enough. He told Paul that he was ready to dissolve their business partnership and go start his own gym if he had to start his own gym. That got Paul's attention. He stood up and walked right towards Alex, and Alex was a big guy, but Paul was like a giant. Paul was 6'7" tall with a massive chest and huge arms. And Paul just started screaming, and Alex screamed right back. But Alex knew Paul was not someone to mess with when he was high and also angry, so pretty quickly, Alex just said he was done talking for the night and he walked out of the office. From the hallway, Alex heard Paul scream at the top of his lungs and then he heard the sound of an office chair go flying into the wall. Alex angrily clenched his jaw, picked up his pace, and grabbed his coat from behind the front desk. Then he headed out the back door of the gym to the parking lot. He climbed into his black Yukon SUV and took off. And as he drove, he figured Paul was still probably screaming and throwing more furniture. The following day at the gym, Paul apologized to Alex. Alex was used to this. His friend would do drugs, he would lash out, say stupid things, and then feel bad about it the next day and say he was sorry. Alex accepted Paul's apology like he always did, but he just felt tired from having to deal with the same thing over and over again. Alex was all about family, and he loved the people close to him almost unconditionally, but even he was reaching a breaking point with Paul. And he knew he was not the only one who felt this way. Paul's wife, Lean, was also fed up with Paul's drug use and angry outbursts. In fact, she was so upset with her husband that she'd gone to stay with her mother in Florida until she could figure out if she even wanted to stay married. Alex knew that Lean leaving had made it really hard on Paul, but he couldn't blame her. After all, the night before, Alex had threatened to leave Paul and go start his own gym, and Alex had meant what he said, but he knew scrapping the Dolphin Fitness Club and trying to start his own gym would not happen overnight. So Alex decided to look at all of his options and start putting together a new business plan. That way, he would feel like he was working towards something, and in the meantime, He hoped and prayed that Paul would get his life together and go back to being the great business partner and best friend that he used to be. A couple of weeks later, on the night of January 17th, 2001, Alex was back behind the front desk at the gym. Paul had taken a couple of nights off, which left Alex to run the place on his own. But Alex was used to that, and he really hoped the time away from the gym would do Paul some good. Alex made his usual rounds on the gym floor, talking to customers and encouraging the weightlifters. And then at some point, he heard a woman who was over on the exercise machines shout, "Big Al." Over the music, Alex turned and smiled at the woman and began walking over to her. When he reached her, she was very sweaty and out of breath, and she told him right away how excited she was about all the results she was seeing from all her exercising. But she told Alex that she just could not get on board with the music that was playing, and could he please change it? Alex laughed and said of course he would change it, but she told him there was actually this one particular album that really motivated her to work even harder at the gym. And she said Alex had played it during a fitness class that she'd taken from him. And immediately, Alex knew exactly the song she was talking about. He said he had the CD in his car and he'd just go grab it. Then he turned away from the woman and began walking towards the back door. The cold air hit Alex as soon as he walked out to the parking lot. It was around 35 degrees Fahrenheit, so just above freezing. Alex's coat was still hanging up inside the gym, but it wasn't worth going back for. He'd spent enough winters in Amityville to be used to this kind of cold. So, Alex hustled across the parking lot to his black Yukon. When he got to it, he opened up the driver's side door and the dome light came on. Alex leaned into the SUV and started digging through the CDs that he kept in a case in the passenger seat. Then Alex heard someone shouting behind him in the parking lot, so he pulled his head out of the SUV and he turned to see what was going on. And when he did, he saw someone running directly towards him in the darkness. Back inside the gym, the woman who had asked Alex to change the music wiped the sweat from her forehead and looked off towards the back exit. Alex had been gone way longer than she thought he would be, but she figured he must be just having a hard time finding the CD. Or maybe he'd stopped in his office to make a phone call before coming back to the gym floor. But then the woman saw something and she screamed. Several people stopped their workouts and ran to her to see if she was okay, but she just pointed towards the back of the gym. And then more screams rang out above the music. Alex staggered onto the gym floor. Blood poured down his neck and soaked through his shirt. People ran up to him and he looked at them, and in a strangled voice he said, "I've been shot." Alex collapsed to the ground. A woman who was a nurse rushed to his side and checked his pulse and immediately began administering CPR. At the same time, a man ran to the front desk and grabbed the phone and dialed 911. A few minutes later, police and paramedics arrived at the gym and, right away, Alex was put on a gurney and rushed outside to a waiting ambulance. Someone had turned off the music by this point, so everybody in the gym just stood there in stunned silence. Most of them were in shock, and they couldn't understand what had even just happened. Everybody loved Alex. Why would someone shoot him? The local police stayed to question everybody at the gym about what they had seen, but their main goal was simply just to get names and contact information for everybody who was there. They knew that a violent crime like this one that had seemingly just occurred would quickly be handed off to a larger police force, and so they just wanted to gather up some names to hand off. A couple of hours later, Detective Robert Anderson of the Suffolk County Police Department stepped out of his car in front of the hospital. Anderson looked and dressed more like a professor than a cop, and people who had worked with Anderson during his third eye for years in law enforcement said he had a mind like a professor too. He was highly analytical and rarely satisfied with simple answers. Detective Anderson had gotten word that Alex Alguerre had been shot outside of the gym that he owned, and Alex had been declared dead soon after being rushed to the hospital. From the minute Anderson was told he would be leading a homicide investigation in Amityville, he knew there would be a ton of pressure on him to solve the case fast because Amityville was not your typical town. Amityville, for decades, had been associated with murder and dark forces. Almost 30 years earlier, in 1974, an Amityville man named Ronald DeFeo Jr. had killed his mother, father, 2 brothers, and 2 sisters in their home. The media attention from the mass murder was bad enough for the small, quiet town, But things had only gotten stranger for Amityville after that. The family that wound up moving into the DeFeo house where those murders happened claimed they were terrorized by a demon or some other supernatural entity. The house. This claim eventually drew the attention of very famous paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren, who came out and did their own investigation. And the story of this demon or entity in the home also was eventually turned into a book called The Amityville Horror, and that book has since been spun off into movies and TV shows. I mean, Amityville really became synonymous with evil. And so Detective Anderson knew that Amityville community leaders had worked really hard over the years to kind of correct their image. They didn't want to be known as this violent or cursed town. But this brutal shooting in a gym parking lot threatened to put Amityville right back in the national news for all the wrong reasons. Anderson walked into the hospital and found his way to the private room where Alex's father was waiting for him. Alex's father wiped tears from his face, cleared his throat, and introduced himself to Anderson. But before Alex's father could say much more than his name, he broke down in tears again. Even after Third Eye for years as a cop and dealing with some of the most notorious murders on Long Island, nothing could really prepare Anderson for meeting a parent who had just lost their child. It was the worst kind of loss Anderson could imagine, and seeing Alex's father in so much pain really hit him hard. He told Alex's father how sorry he was for his loss. Then Anderson said he hated to put him on the spot at that moment, but he did need to know if there was anyone who might have wanted to hurt his son. Alex's father wiped away his tears and then told Anderson that Alex was the sweetest, kindest man you'd ever meet, and that everybody who knew him really loved him. But then he said there definitely was one person who could have done this to his son, Alex's best friend and business partner, Paul Rydell. It turned out Alex had told his father all about Paul's drug use and his partying, and he had also told him that he was thinking about scrapping the business with Paul and going out on his own. Anderson thanked Alex's father for his help and told him how sorry he was again. Then Anderson left the hospital and drove back to the station. He wanted to gather as much information as he could on Paul. It didn't take long for Detective Anderson to discover that Paul had had more than his fair share of run-ins with the law. He had served time in prison for drug charges and armed robbery, and he had previously been linked to an illegal sports gambling ring. But Anderson knew that did not mean the man had killed his best friend. So for the time, Anderson put Paul's police record to the side and dug more into his personal life and his relationship with Alex. The local Amityville police had passed along contact information for everybody they found at the gym when they had first arrived there. And when Anderson and his team reached out to those people, they all said pretty much the same thing. Alex was like family and everybody loved him. But Paul, well, he was a mess and he definitely was capable of shooting Alex. Some of Alex's family and closest friends were even more straightforward when they spoke to Anderson. They said they were sure Paul had to be the murderer. So Anderson knew he would just have to go talk to Paul. But he didn't want to drag Paul to the station and chuck him inside of an interrogation room just yet, because he feared as soon as he did that, all of Amityville would decide Paul really was guilty, and so that could potentially destroy an innocent man's life, and it could put even more pressure on police to arrest someone before they were actually ready. So Anderson actually came up with a fairly outside-the-box way to question Paul that was not super formal. Now, it was not going to be ideal by any means, but it was an opportunity Anderson didn't want to miss. His team would talk to Paul at Alex's funeral. Days after Alex's murder, a line of cars stretched out down the street in front of a local funeral home and they wrapped around the corner. Hundreds of people had come to pay their last respects to Alex. Detective Anderson filed into the funeral home behind a group of mourners. It was common for investigators to attend funerals for homicide victims. It gave them a chance to watch how potential suspects acted. But Anderson was really just there to observe Paul and to see if he could get any information from Paul after the service was over. Anderson watched as Paul made his way to the front of the chapel inside of the funeral home. And it immediately became clear to Anderson that it didn't matter to other people that Paul had not been brought in for questioning yet. Clearly, they had already decided Paul was guilty. People literally shouted at Paul as he walked down the aisle towards his best friend's coffins. They told him to leave and said, "How dare he show his face, you were his face hero." Paul didn't engage with any of them. He just stared at the floor and clung to his wife, Lean, as he walked. Detective Anderson couldn't get over how small this enormous guy seemed to look at this very moment. But Anderson didn't know if he should feel sorry for Paul, or if he was just being too cautious and too analytical. Maybe everybody else was right. Maybe this case was clear-cut and Paul really was the killer. Anderson watched as Alex's friends and family talked about how much Alex had meant to them and how proud they had been of him. Alex's father fought back tears and spoke about all the special times he'd shared with his son. Then he broke down and said Alex would never get to experience those kind of moments with a child of his own because someone had taken that chance away from him. After the funeral was over, Anderson and some other members of his team separated from the throng of mourners and followed Paul and his wife, Lean, outside. The investigators approached and, as they did, Paul suddenly stood up to his full height. Suddenly, the small, kind of sad-looking man Anderson had seen inside had disappeared. Paul now looked angry and huge. Clearly, he did not like the fact that police were bothering him at his best friend's funeral. Anderson assured Paul they were only trying to get some basic information, so Paul just said he loved Alex, he would never hurt him, and on the night of the murder, he said he was with friends in another town. For a minute, Anderson figured his big plan to try to question Paul at this funeral was going to turn into a total bust. But right as he was about to give up on this approach, something suddenly stood out to him. Paul's wife, Lean, was standing next to her husband, doing her part as a very supportive spouse. But Anderson had briefly spoken to Lean in the days following the murder, so he knew that she and Paul had serious problems in their marriage, and that she had even gone to Florida to get away from Paul. And so now, Anderson wanted to know if she had had, a big change of heart about her husband, which is why she was now being so supportive, or if she was acting supportive out of fear. If Paul had really killed Alex and Lean knew about it, was she just afraid she'd be next if she didn't support him? On January 23rd, 2001, so 6 days after the murder, Detective Anderson met with Lean at her grandmother's house in a small town that was not too far from Amityville. Lean was short and thin with long brown hair, and she sounded like a native New Yorker. She led Anderson into a warm, rustic-looking kitchen and they sat down at the table. Anderson didn't want Lean to feel like she was being interrogated, so when he spoke to her like they were just friends catching up. Anderson asked Lean about the funeral and how she felt when she was there, and very quickly she made it clear that she had not gone there out of fear or anything like that. She had been there because she loved her friend Alex and she wanted to support her husband, Paul. She said that despite their marital issues, they really had been working hard on their marriage. But Anderson wasn't convinced, and so he pressed Lean a bit and he asked what had happened that made her leave New York and go to Florida in the first place. Lean said she'd left because Paul was partying and doing drugs, as she felt like that was a terrible environment for her kid. But Lean was clear that she did not believe Paul would ever kill his friend Alex. Sure, the two men fought sometimes, but they were like brothers, and brothers fight. She knew Paul loved Alex. Anderson said he understood, and then he asked her if there was anything else she could think of that might help with the investigation. Lean shifted in her chair and then looked around the room like she was trying to make sure nobody else was listening. Then she leaned closer to Anderson and, in a quiet voice, she told him there was something going on that he needed to know about. Paul had gotten into trouble with the mob, and he had actually received a rat card in the mail. Anderson hid his surprise pretty well, but this was news to him. He knew Paul had a police record and that he'd been linked to some low-level criminals who might have loose ties to the mob, but receiving a rat card meant that members of the mob believed Paul had sold them out to the police, an unforgivable offense in the world of organized crime. Then Lean told Anderson that things had actually gotten even worse after that. At a big party a year earlier, Paul had gotten into this big public argument with a man who wound up being a captain in the Gambino organized crime family. At the time, the Gambinos were one of the most powerful mafia organizations in New York City. Lean said Paul never told her what the argument was about, but she was pretty sure he owed a lot of money to some very powerful people. Detective Anderson listened quietly, and he still didn't show anything on his face. But he knew this case might have just taken a major turn. It was one thing for Paul to be connected to some small-time criminals in Amityville, New York, but it was a whole different thing for Paul to be in debt to high-ranking members of a New York City mafia family. Anderson talked to Lean a little while longer and then thanked her for her time. He headed out to his car and drove back to Amityville. In the course of only a few hours, Anderson had been forced to take a completely different view on this case. He still considered Paul a suspect, but now Anderson had a totally new theory as to what could have happened. He thought maybe the mafia had put out a hit on Alex, so Paul's best friend, as a way to warn Paul, "Pay us the money you owe us, or you'll be next." In February of 2001, so about a month after Alex's murder, Detective Anderson got word that Paul and Lean had reconciled and repaired their marriage. But there was more to the story than that. Paul had moved with Lean and their kid down to Florida. And members of Alex's family and a lot of other people in Amityville were up in arms about it. Many people in the community had never stopped believing that Paul killed Alex, and now they thought Paul had left the state to run away from the crime he had committed. The pressure on Anderson to arrest Paul continued to grow, and some people questioned whether Anderson was even doing his job, but Anderson understood their frustration. He also wanted to bring Alex's killer to justice, but he wasn't just going to cave in and arrest Paul because he actually didn't have any concrete evidence against Paul. Anderson's team had confirmed Paul's alibi for the night of the murder, and they combed over the crime scene at the gym multiple times, and nothing they found directly linked Paul to Alex's murder. On top of that, Anderson was following up on leads that connected Paul to the mafia. He was supposedly in debt to dangerous men. He had had that public fight with a member of the Gambino family. And Alex's murder did seem to look like it could have been a mob-style hit. So Anderson remained focused and calm, and he kept pursuing all of the possible leads in the case. He also told his team not to be swayed by public opinion. Just because others had already made up their minds about what had happened did not mean they needed to do that too. But over the next month, Anderson hit one dead end after another. He couldn't discover any definitive links between Paul and the Gambino family or any other high-ranking members in the mafia. Then in April, so 3 months after Alex's murder, Anderson found out that Lean was pregnant. And this news sparked another round of anger from the Amityville community and threatened to make Anderson's job even harder than it already was. People were outraged that Paul was allowed to carry on with his life and watch his family grow after he had robbed his best friend, Alex, of a chance to start his own family. Anderson continued to sympathize with the people who were frustrated with him. He knew they just wanted answers. So Anderson kept working every angle of the case he could think of, but he felt like he was running out of time. He needed a break in the case to help appease his loudest critics and to at least give Alex's family some hope that justice would be served. On November 11th, 2001, so almost 10 months after Alex's murder, a detective from the New York City Police Department sat across the table from a guy in custody and listened to him, rambling about how he could help the police. The NYPD detective almost found the whole thing kind of amusing. It was pretty common for people in custody to try to cut a deal by giving up information on crimes that were even worse than the ones they'd committed. A lot of times, though, the so-called leads these people provided went absolutely nowhere. But occasionally, some leads would pan out. So the detective sat there with a slight smile on his face and just listened. But then the guy in custody said something that really caught the detective's attention. And so his smile disappeared and he leaned forward and told the guy to slow down and repeat what he just said. The guy nodded and leaned in closer, almost like he and the detective were on the same team. Then he repeated what he had just said. He said he knew who had killed that gym owner in Amityville, and he knew why they killed him. Now remember, Amityville is a small town about 2 hours away from Manhattan, and so criminals trying to cut a deal with the NYPD did not usually reference small-town crimes like this one. So the detective sensed this could actually be legitimate. So he got all the details he could from this guy in custody about Alex Aldiari's murder. Then the detective walked out of the room, went to his desk, and made a phone call. A second later, an officer with the Suffolk County Police told Detective Anderson there was a call for him from an NYPD detective. The officer said that this detective was calling with information about the Alex Aldiari case, and it could potentially break the case wide open. Anderson walked to his desk, and as he did, he felt a rush of adrenaline. This was the first time in months that he actually might have a possible new lead. On the phone, The NYPD detective told Anderson about the conversation he just had with the guy in custody. Both detectives were well aware that desperate people under arrest were not usually the most reliable sources because they basically will do anything to get out of custody. But the NYPD detective thought the information he gotten was actually worth passing on. Anderson listened to the detective and scribbled down the name of a man that he needed to track down. Anderson thanked the NYPD detective for his help, and then he quickly rounded up his team and told them they might finally have a major break in the Alex Olgiari case. The information Anderson got from the NYPD detective led him right to a man who was supposedly involved in Alex's murder. The man was clearly struggling with drug addiction. He seemed jittery and all over the place when he spoke, and he spun a wild story about how and why Alex had been murdered. At first, Anderson wasn't sure he could believe anything this man told him, but Anderson and his team dug deeper into the man's story and several of the details checked out. And after that meeting, it would still take Detective Anderson several months to put everything together, but he finally had evidence connecting someone directly to Alex's murder based on interviews conducted throughout the investigation and evidence found at the scene. Here's a reconstruction of what police believe happened on the night of January 17, 2001, when somebody murdered Alex outside of his gym. At about 7:00 p.m., a white Mini and drove past the Dolphin Fitness Club. Inside the van were the people. There was the driver and also the killer. And the killer was scanning the area for the perfect spot to stake the place out. Both people inside the van wore zip-up hooded sweatshirts, and the killer rested a .38 caliber pistol on his knee. The killer pointed to an empty parking space on the street that had a clear view of the employee parking lot. So the driver drove around towards the back of the gym, pulled the van into that parking space, and then turned off the engine. Then the driver and the killer kept their eyes fixed on the employee parking lot and made small talk to pass the time. The killer figured it could be hours before they could make their move, but they were willing to wait as long as it took, because this area, this employee parking lot, offered the best place to shoot someone without being seen. The lot was dark and only a few people ever parked there. The killer checked their gun to make sure it was loaded. Then they, along with the driver, just kept on talking and watching the parking lot. But then just 20 minutes later, the killer suddenly sat up in the passenger seat and leaned in closer to the window. The wait had not been long at all. Their target was already in the parking lot, walking towards his black Yukon SUV. The killer told the driver to start the van and to be ready to speed out of there. The killer clutched the pistol tight in one hand, then opened the door with the other and walked into the parking lot. The killer saw Alex open up his car door and lean inside, and as he did, the dome light came on. Not wanting to be too close to the light, the killer shouted something at Alex just to get his attention and to kind of pull him away from his vehicle in the light. And it worked, because Alex turned to see who was yelling at him, and he took a few steps away from his car towards the killer. And at that point, the killer just rushed out of the darkness and got within a couple of feet of Alex, who had no idea what was going on. And the killer raised his gun and fired before Alex could do anything. The first bullet hit Alex square in the chest. Then the killer squeezed off 3 more shots, one right after the other. Bullets struck Alex across his upper body, perforating his heart and both of his lungs. Then the killer fired off 1 more shot, which hit Alex in the neck. Alex fell to the ground, covered in blood. At this point, the killer turned and ran back to the white van. The killer never saw Alex pulling himself up and staggering back towards the gym. As soon as the killer was back inside the van, they slammed the door shut and yelled for the driver to go. So the driver whipped out of the parking space and sped down the street. A few minutes later, the driver heard ambulance and police sirens on the other side of the road, so they eased off the gas. They didn't want to draw attention to the van. When they were a few miles away from the gym, the killer spotted a creek just off the side of the road. So they rolled down their window and hurled the gun into the water. Then they told the driver to floor it, and the van sped down the road again. Not long after that, the driver pulled onto the highway and the van headed south, far away from Amityville, New York. The following night, the killer and the driver sat in the killer's living room reading an online story about the murder. The shooting outside the gym had made the national news, but the killer and driver read the story more than once because they could not believe what they were seeing. Then the front door opened and Before the killer could even say anything, a woman barged in and shouted at him at the top of her lungs, "You stupid bastard, Adam. You killed the wrong guy." It would turn out Lean Rydell, Paul's wife, had set up the hit outside of the gym, but Alex was never the intended target. Lean had wanted her husband, Paul, dead, and the killer, a man named Rocco Salerno, had been more than happy to oblige. Because it turned out that Lean and Rocco had been having an affair since Lean had left New York and went to stay with her mother in Florida. Lean and Rocco had fallen in love and wanted to start their lives together, but Paul was in the way. To make things worse, Paul had already filed with the court in New York to begin divorce proceedings. And if Paul and Lean got divorced, well, New York law would require Lean to come back to the state and live within 50 miles of Paul so he could see his son. But Lean didn't want to leave Florida and Rocco, so she and Rocco hatched a plan to murder Paul. Rocco paid a guy he knew $3,000 to drive him to New York, scope out the gym with him, and serve as his getaway driver after the shooting took place. So on the night of the murder, Rocco and this driver are sitting there and they see this huge guy walk into the parking lot and he goes to his black Yukon. And Rocco thought this was his target because Paul was also a big guy who happened to own the same make and model of black Yukon that his best friend, Alex, owned. So Rocco rushed out of the van and gunned down Alex in cold blood, not realizing he had shot the wrong person. When Lean discovered what had happened, she came up with a way to try to fix things. She reconciled with Paul so he wouldn't divorce her and make her move back to New York. Then she convinced Paul to move to Florida because so many people in Amityville, including his friends, were treating him like a murderer. And then once they were back in Florida, Lean just continued her affair with Rocco. And her plan was to divorce Paul after both of them had become Florida residents because that way she would not be forced to leave the state. And all of this came to light after the guy in custody with the NYPD told police he had information about Alex's murder. It turned out the guy in custody actually happened to know the driver of the white minivan. And so this guy in custody had actually heard all the details of everything that had happened during the murder. So Detective Anderson tracked the driver down and he discovered that the driver was struggling with a drug problem. And the driver said that's why he had accepted the $3,000 to drive Rocco to and from the gym in Amityville. And the driver quickly cut a plea deal, and he would give authorities everything they needed to bring Rocco in. But even with Rocco in custody, Lean denied having anything to do with the murder. She said she had always loved Paul and that they had even had a second child together. Lean also tried to act like she barely knew Rocco, but soon it became clear that the child that Lean had recently given birth to was not her husband Paul's, it was Rocco's child. And at that point, all of Lean's denials about her role in this murder quickly fell apart. The actual killer, Rocco Salerno, was convicted of conspiracy and first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. As for Lean, she was convicted of conspiracy and first-degree murder as well, and was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. She continued to maintain her innocence and appealed her conviction, but the appeal was denied. Alex's best friend Paul might have had some demons, but he had nothing to do with his friend's murder. Paul was granted custody of his and Lean's child, and with his child, he returned to Amityville. He ended up renaming the gym Big Al's Family Fitness in honor of his fallen friend. And Paul has said that he strives to live his life and run his business with the type of integrity and kindness